So, good afternoon, everyone.
Now, today we'll talk about, we talked in the last lecture while we were talking about the origins of the Cold War, right? And we talked about the origins of the Cold War, the Marshall Plan, the Molotov Plan, the Berlin blockade, the lifting of the Berlin blockade, all these things, right? And we had talked about that the beginning of the Cold War was one of the direct consequences of the differences in the way in which World War II was itself handled, and also given the ideological divisions at this point of time over the involvement of the state and capitalism. That you see that the communist-led bloc on the one side and the Western-led bloc on the other. Now, today we'll talk about another simultaneous thing. So we'll talk about the major Cold War era wars today. Also, we'll talk about the Chinese Communist Revolution, something that we've not talked about. We've not talked about Japan also, right? So Italy and Japan's military fascism is also something that we'll talk about. But first, let's talk about some of the major Cold War era wars and their significances, because this can be a direct question, whether it's on the Korean War or the Vietnam War or the Korean, the Vietnam, or the Cuban Missile Crisis. There are 3 or 4 some of the direct ones. Also, we'll talk about a certain other number of developments, such as the Chinese Communist Party coming to power in 1949, and also the role of Mao in the coming of the Chinese Communist Revolution, and even after that, from 1949 till 1960s. So, to talk about all of it, let's first begin with the Cold War era. Now, in the Cold War era, you see that the first major war actually that we say had broken out, indirectly between the Western-led bloc and the Communist bloc was over the Korean question. And this was the Korean War. The Korean War is the first major military conflict that broke out in the Cold War era. Now, 1945, United States had already done its nuclear weapons tests and had successfully used them in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. At the same point of time, by 1949, even the Soviet Union had managed to conduct its nuclear weapons tests. And you see that the official beginning of the nuclear age in that manner, that both the major powers of the world had nuclear weapons, had started from 1949 onwards. Now, what you see is that in 1950, the Korean War is the first major war that broke out from 1950 to 1953. Now, this was a war which, this was considered as one of the first important wars of the Cold War era, which had a profound significance in terms of that it became a later guide for other US interventions also. And how do we say that, and why do we say that? That's something that we'll understand. In terms of the Korean War, you see that after 1945, this was the first time when the US Army was being involved in any war. So the US Army is involved in the Korean War. The US Army, after the Korean War, is also involved in the Vietnam War and partly in the Cuban Missile Crisis also. Okay. Now, what you see is that in Korea, in 1950, actually what happens is that Korea was under the Japanese control from 1930s onwards itself. In fact, Korea was under the Japanese control because Japan had also moved towards aggressive expansion in the whole of the Asian peninsula in a search for raw materials as well as search for market. And Korea was a Japanese colony even much before from that. So almost for 25-30 years, Korea had been under the Japanese control. And once the Japanese were defeated in World War II, you see the question arose as to what is going to happen in Korea. Now, so once the Japanese surrendered by 1945, the question that had arose in Korea was, what was going to be the future of Korea? Whether it would be a multi-party democratic state, whether it will be a communist state, or whether it would acquire some other form. Now, this was a question which was up in the air. And 1945 to 1949, after the surrender of Japan, you see that in the north, the Communist Party in the north, the Communist Party had become seemingly more popular, and it was being led by Kim Il-sung. So the Communist Party in Northern Korea had relatively became more popular. It also had the indirect support of the Soviet Union, which was supporting it in terms of material and economic assistance. So in the north, the Communist Party was relatively more popular and had staked claim to power. And in the south, you see that the United States was concerned that the domino theory must not actually become a real reality. That in 1949, actually, you see that China had become a communist state. Soviet Union anyways was a communist state. And if in Korea also a communist state was to be established, this was clearly a ripple effect according to the United States, and something that would spill off into other regions as well. So by 1949, even though in the north the Communist Party was popular, United States got increasingly concerned and wanted to contain the spread of communism in Korea. And so you see they started supporting, and they were willing to support anybody who was strongly anti-communist in nature, even if they were pro-democratic or a military dictator or any other form of government, as long as it was anti-communist. So you see that by the beginning of 1950, in the north, while Kim Il-sung's army was in control, in the south, the US backed other player, that is Syngman Rhee, comes in place. Now Syngman Rhee is a military dictator. He is not a pro-democrat or anything. In fact, South Korea, as something that you will see, never had a democracy till late 1970s. It is only then after late 1970s that it's having the first election. For the first 27 years, even after 1953, South Korea did not have a democracy. It was almost a military dictatorship that existed. Now 1950 onwards, you see that while in the north the Kim Il-sung forces were in place, while in the south Syngman Rhee, supported by the United States, was in place. However, and in 1950 both these forces were stationed at the 38th parallel. Okay, I'll show you a map in which you will see that both these forces were stationed at the 38th parallel. And the 38th parallel is the same line which divides North Korea and South Korea today. Okay, so the 38th parallel was in place, and at this point of time, you see that in the beginning of 1950, the North Korean forces attacked South Korea. So the beginning of the Korean War happens. Why? Because North Korea under Kim Il-sung wanted to expand the communist government and throughout the Korean peninsula and overthrow Syngman Rhee's dictatorship in the south. And however, Syngman Rhee was not a very popular dictator even in the south. Even though he was not a very popular dictator in the south, also he was not a multi-party, he was not in favor of any multi-party elections in South Korea, and yet the US government was supporting it, primarily seeing it as an important defense against the spread of communism. So 1950 this war begins, and I'll just show you a map where there's a very popular map about the Korean War that basically tells you briefly of what happened in the war. The significance is something. Yes, this is the. So when you talk about the Korean War, the significance of the Korean War is something which is important from our mains examination point of view, and something that we'll talk about. So, just a second. Okay, so I think there's some. So when you see the map, the 1950, when the war began, you see the North Korean forces attacked South Korean forces. And this is where the attack begins. And initially, the North Korean forces were usually successful, as you see in the red area. And Kim Il-sung's attack was relatively successful, supported by the Soviet Union in terms of both economic assistance, even in terms of military assistance by providing weaponry. So with the support from the Soviet Union, the North Korean forces pushed back the South Korean forces very significantly, only to a small area in the south, which is the Busan area. And Busan is the area where to support, which was the military base also of the United States in the region. The US-backed forces were stationed at Busan to provide any kind of support needed to the South Korean forces if the North Korean forces tried to change the status quo. And to that extent, you see that the South Korean government was quickly reduced to in an area around the area of southern Korea in Busan. And you see that thus by 1950 itself, you see that in June and September. So within a span of few months, they had reduced South Korea to nothing. And at this point of time, US approached the United Nations. The Korean War is considered significant. Why? Because this was the first major test of the United Nations. If the United Nations had come into power to protect the territorial sovereignty of the member states, then this was the first major test, as North Korea was clearly the aggressor. At this point of time, US approached the United Nations asking for a UN authorized intervention to push back the North Korean forces. The UN authorization was granted primarily because Soviet Union was not taking part in these UN meetings at this point of time, because it was opposing the United Nations, boycotting the United Nations at this time, primarily because the United Nations had still not recognized the People's Republic of China or Mao's government in China, which had come into power. So the Soviet Union was boycotting, so there was no question of a veto. But and so while the Soviet Union was boycotting, US moved a resolution asking for a UN intervention and UN-led forces to enter into South Korea and push back the North Korean forces. This permission was granted, and this was the first major successful UN intervention that happened. And roughly, to begin with, roughly 40,000 troops, predominantly 90% of these troops were US troops, though there were troops from other countries also. In reality, most of the troops that were pushed into South Korea were the US troops. And these US troops were pushed into South Korea, and at this point of time, the UN mission was being led by General MacArthur, Douglas MacArthur. Douglas MacArthur was a US military general who had played a key role in defeating Japan during World War II in the Asian Pacific region. And Douglas MacArthur was given the charge of this task as well, where you see that MacArthur came up with the plan that if we try, MacArthur came up with this plan that if we try to push the North Korean forces back all the way, it is going to be a much more difficult exercise. And rather, should or should not the US forces, should they cross the 38th parallel or not? Okay, because if their aim was only to restrict the spread of communism to South Korea, then that could have been achieved even. But rather than stopping, you see that the US forces actually intervened and continued their intervention much beyond the 38th parallel. And at this point of time, Douglas MacArthur convinced Truman that we should not just look at containing communism in North Korea, we should probably look at eliminating communism from the whole of the Korean peninsula. And so you see that MacArthur was of the opinion that US would quickly overthrow the communist government in North Korea. However, this was not to happen, as you would know that currently the boundary stands at the 38th parallel, in the sense that this was not to happen because as the US forces led up to moved much beyond the 38th parallel, pushing the communist government in North close to the Yalu River, the Chinese were apprehensive. And and also the Soviet government provided more ammunition and monetary support to the North Korean forces. Also, as they reached close to the Yalu River, MacArthur wanted to, as MacArthur reached close to the Yalu River separates North Korea from China. Okay, so as the US forces reached close to the Yalu River, there was already a concern that the Chinese may also respond militarily if they were to find the US forces coming pretty close. Because if the aim of United States was to prevent or contain the spread of communism, they could even try and intervene in China. And also the Chinese government had still not been recognized by the United States. Okay, so in that context, the Chinese were already apprehensive, and as soon as the US forces reached close to the Yalu River, the Chinese troops crossed over from the Yalu River and entered into North Korea. And you see that the North Korean with the assistance from the Soviet Union forces and partly also from China, you see that the North Korean forces were able to push back the US forces, and the war lasted for another 3 years. And by 1953, both North Korea and South Korea and US were looking at a similar situation with which they began in 1950. At this time, another peace conference was called, and an armistice was declared. And this is not the official line. North Korea does not recognize this as official limit of their territorial existence, nor does South Korea. But this is an armistice which was reached between the two, that without prejudice to their contested claims, both recognized or both entered into the peace treaty to maintain peace and to call off the confrontation at this point of time. Now, the Korean War is considered significant and important primarily because this was the first major UN-led intervention. This was also the first major war after the World War II in which the US troops were significantly involved. And the Korean War was also to set a template for future US interventions. To US, they had, even though they had not managed to throw over communism from the whole of the Korean peninsula, in the US foreign policy sense, its objective had been achieved. That if its objective was to contain the spread of communism, that had been achieved with a US-led intervention in Korean affairs. And a similar strategy was to be tried from 1954 onwards, where again, US intervention in Vietnam was primarily aimed at restricting the Communist Party in Vietnam, the Vietnamese Congress, to North Vietnam. But that intervention did not succeed. But nonetheless, the North Vietnamese, in Vietnam also, the intervention that happened from 1954 onwards was hugely inspired from the 1950-53 intervention in Korea. So the US idea was that if Korea was something to learn from, then if we do not take action, then communism will continue to spread. And if we do manage to take decisive actions in the nick of the time, then we can check the spread of communism. And Korea was an example of that. So the Korean intervention was also to serve as a template for further US interventions. Okay. So that is also something which is there. Now that is where the conflict even stands today. In the North Korean, the communist, and in South Korea, after late 1970s and beginning of 1980s, South Korea moved over from a dictatorship sort of a structure to a multi-party democracy. So even South Korea's movement towards a democratic structure was slow, but nonetheless, it was kept away from communism to begin with. Now, that is there. The other next one that we have to talk about is the Vietnam War. Now, in terms of Vietnam War, this is also considered a very important war, primarily because this had a huge, profound impact on US foreign policy once the war got over. Also, this was a war which was the first major televised war which was broadcasted on US television. This was also a major war which involved US troops in very large numbers. Upwards of 4 lakh US troops were involved in this war. And also this was a war in which United States did not achieve any of its objectives that it had set out for itself. And this was also a pretty long drawn out war. This is also called as the 10,000-day war, because the US involvement in this war happened from 1954 till 1973. Okay, so 1954 till 1973 is almost 20 years. right? 20 years of almost indirect and then later direct involvement in a war, something which even did not achieve its stated objective. So that is why the US policy of intervention actually witnessed a significant slowdown after the 1970s, when the Vietnam War did not go down according to their expectations. So that's also something that we'll talk about. Now, what is happening in Vietnam is, and when we talk about the Vietnam War, we actually talk from 1945 till 1973 period. Okay, so in the Vietnam War, we predominantly talk about the 1945. Yeah. See, why could not US eliminate communism from North Korea is primarily as to why couldn't US, because any elimination of communism, that is why that was never even the aim of their official policy. Elimination of communism is not the aim primarily because elimination would require what? A brutal use of force, right? And elimination would require a brutal use of force, and a brutal use of force in the aftermath of World War II could always lead to the breakout of a nuclear war. Because if communism was to be overthrown from Korea, there was always the possibility that it could provoke a nuclear confrontation between the Soviet Union and the United States. That is one of the major reasons that their aim was not elimination of communism, or it was primarily to contain the spread of communism. That's one of the primary reasons. Now, in terms of the Vietnam War, we basically say, in terms of the Vietnam War, we basically say that there are, this war is from 1945 till 1973. 3 phases is in which this war is divided. I'll tell you why the war happened and all of that in a minute. But 1945 to 1954 to 1968. This is the first phase, this is the second phase, and this is the third phase. Now, the Vietnam War, so this is just for you to know firstly broadly of what structure we're going to talk about. Now, why did the war break out in the very first place? See, Vietnam was a part of the French Indochina region, and this French Indochina region was a French colony. But the French, once they had been defeated, once they were being defeated by the Japanese at the beginning of World War II, you see that as the French withdrew, the Japanese took over the control in these regions. And once the Japanese withdrew in 1945 after their surrender, you see that once the Japanese withdrew, the question was that there was a strong nationalist sentiment in many of these regions, including in Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh was one of the strong Vietnamese nationalist leaders who had argued that once the Japanese withdrew or were overthrown, the Vietnamese would take charge of their own fate. However, France had different ideas, and France wanted to reassert its control over the French Indochina region, including Vietnam, after World War II. Given that the French and the British forces had defeated the Japanese, the French wanted to reinstate their control over the Vietnam region after World War II. However, Ho Chi Minh and his party, the Vietnamese Congress, were not of the opinion that they would submit to the French forces again, and they argued in favor of independence. And that is why, as the French troops were moved back into Vietnam, you see the beginning of the Vietnamese War, where in the first phase from 1945 to 1954, the Vietnamese forces were fighting the French forces, and the Vietnamese Congress was fighting the French forces, and they ultimately managed to force the French to withdraw from the region in 1954. In a peace treaty called in 1954, the French agreed to peacefully withdraw from the region, and Vietnamese independence almost became certain. At this point of time, the problem actually was again on the question of communism. That though the French were withdrawing, Ho Chi Minh was an individual who had links with the Communist Party with the Soviet Communist Party, and he had also he had links with both the Soviet Communist Party and also the Chinese Communist Party. He had also spent some part of his time, including for guerrilla training, in the Soviet Union. So the West was increasingly apprehensive about the Ho Chi Minh. and his affiliations to the communists, as many predicted that soon Ho Chi Minh would shift to communism, and that would mean that Vietnam would also become a communist ruled state. At this point of time, the memory of the Korean War was anyways afresh in the US minds. And you see that as the French withdrew in 1954, in Vietnam, in the North Vietnam, Vietnamese Congress or Ho Chi Minh was already in control. They were already controlling the territories of North Vietnam. And as the French withdrew, they aimed to take over the control of the whole Vietnamese peninsula. Now, one of the difference between, Vietnam and Korea was that Ho Chi Minh was an intensely popular individual and a very popular nationalist leader in Vietnam. His allegiance to communism was secondary to his nationalistic impulses. Ho Chi Minh had made it clear that he would not settle down for any kind of division of Vietnam into North Vietnam or South Vietnam, and rather he wanted a unified Vietnam under the control of the Vietnamese Congress. Okay, whether they stick to whether they take communist part or whichever path, but they would want a united Vietnam. At this point of time, as the French forces withdrew, who were predominantly located in South Vietnam, the North Vietnamese forces started taking control. And now again, you see a US intervention. Now, the US intervention happened in a way that in South Vietnam, you see that in South Vietnam, you see that the other anti-communist ruler that was again supported by the United States was Ngo Diem. Diem was another military dictator in South Vietnam, which was being supported by the United States. But while Ho Chi Minh was extremely popular both in northern and southern states, Diem was not at all popular in southern Vietnam. Nonetheless, in a repeat of Korean War, you see that the US forces supported Diem's installation of Diem's government as the French withdrew in South Vietnam. And this is where you see the beginning of the conflict. But in contrast to Korean War, the Vietnam War was not a UN-sanctioned intervention. This was not a UN-sanctioned intervention because the Soviet Union blocked any resolution that US wanted to introduce on the Vietnamese question. And thus, US was not directly involved in the war to begin with. Initially, the US government started sending in military advisors from 1954 onwards. These military advisors were to train and aid the South Vietnamese forces. And they started with roughly around 500. Soon that increased to 5,000. And by 1959, some 15 to 20,000 US military advisors were there in South Vietnam. However, the US was still not officially involved in the war. US was still not officially involved in the war, primarily because there was no direct reason. Many argued that US needed to be involved in this war. If there was a sentiment in the United States which wanted to contain communism, there was another sentiment which was of the opinion that why should US fight wars which were not of its own direct interest? Okay, so the US was still not officially involved in the war, and you see, but it was aiding the South Vietnamese government. Now the situation actually stretched on to be more precise, and till 1964. That in 1964, what you see is one of the major incidents that took place, and that was the Gulf of Tonkin incident. Now, the Gulf of Tonkin, actually, if you look at Vietnam, I'll show you a map later. If you look at Vietnam, what you see is that this is where is the Gulf of Tonkin. The Gulf of Tonkin was actually, and this is North Vietnam, and this is South. So, okay, so in terms of North Vietnam and South Vietnam, what you see that Gulf of Tonkin was one of the areas close to the North Vietnamese boundary. And in this Gulf of Tonkin, the US naval ships were patrolling at this point of time to ensure that there is no breakout of any unlikely event. In 1964, the US Navy reported to the US Parliament, firstly to the US President, and the US President reported to the US Parliament and the Senate that in the Gulf of Tonkin, the US naval ships had been attacked and fired upon by the Japanese patrol boats, by the North Vietnamese patrol boats. So the North Vietnamese patrol boats had fired upon a US naval ship, and this is an attack on the US, which the North Vietnamese have launched. And this is what was called as the Gulf of Tonkin incident. This incident was placed as a reason before the US Senate to obtain an approval for a direct and a full involvement in the war. Because in US, as you would know, that in terms of foreign policy, the Senate has a strong say. And any declaration of war, at least officially, cannot happen without the Senate having passed a resolution to the same. In India, for example, that's not the case, right? The Prime Minister can easily proclaim, or through the President, a war against any other state. But in US, any proclamation of war requires that a bill must be passed by the US Senate. Okay, so you see that in the Gulf of Tonkin incident, this incident was cited as a reason with which the US President obtained a full approval from the US Senate for a full and direct involvement of troops in the war. However, later it was revealed that that nothing like the Gulf of Tonkin incident had happened. And if you would apply even a bit of common sense, it becomes clear that why would a naval patrol boat attack a naval ship? Okay, and that too, a Vietnamese naval patrol boat would attack a US naval ship. So this is more even unconvincing to believe. Later investigations proved that the US President had lied to the US Parliament and the US Senate, to be more precise. And whether he had been lied to is not very sure, but somebody in the chain of command had lied to someone. And that was the reason why the Gulf of Tonkin was cited as a reason for obtaining an approval for US intervention. 1964 onwards, the US direct involvement of troops increased in the war quickly, and a large number of US troops were involved from 1964 onwards. And you see that 1964 onwards, as the US troop involvement increased in the war, also came the question of what is the objective and how quickly it is going to be achieved. If the objective was to contain the spread of communism, and if this was to be quickly achieved, many US presidents, in fact, John F. Kennedy, or then Richard Nixon, and Lyndon B. Johnson, all the three US presidents actually promised that the US intervention in the war would be brief and successful, and we will quickly defeat the North Vietnamese forces and prevent this and contain the spread of communism. However, that was not true, and even after 1964, you see as the US involvement in the war increased dramatically, the North Vietnamese forces continued to hold on and even moved more towards the South Vietnam. This was because the North Vietnamese forces had a much better knowledge of the local terrain than the US forces. The US forces were fighting on a completely alien land, somewhere where they had never been before, and where they had no knowledge of the local terrain. So you see, and the North Vietnamese forces had an expertise in guerrilla warfare. The result was that the North Vietnamese forces were actually the relatively more successful one. And again, you see, in 1968, actually, the US president again was apparently lying to the US public, where he was proclaiming that in September 1968, that the US forces would be back home by Christmas, and by Christmas of 1968, the US intervention in Vietnam would be complete. From 1964 to 1968, as US was actually not anywhere close to a victory in Vietnam, the US president had been openly proclaiming again and again in the US parliament as well as in the US media that it was the United States which was winning. and the North Vietnamese forces were on the back foot. But the opposite of this was happening. And in 1968, you see that this lie, again, is caught because in 1968, there is something that's called the Tet Offensive. The Tet Offensive was actually a simultaneous attack by Ho Chi Minh's forces upon South Vietnam, which had forced the US forces almost to the brink of South Vietnam. And when it became clear that, the Tet Offensive was the battle in which the US forces suffered a great military setback, even suffering a loss of lives of a number of US soldiers. So by 1968 end, it became clear that the war was nowhere close to be over. And at this point of time, you see that there were, even from 1964 onwards, and now the protests in United States intensified against the involvement in this war, which they said was not a war of any direct consequence to the US people. US troops were being involved and slaughtered in large numbers in a war to achieve the aims which were not even clear. And this was something which was widely protested against in US universities, primarily because US universities and higher education institutions saw public protests where the youth primarily opposed the involvement of the US Army in the war. And this is also the time when many universities burned the US national flag, and there was a tremendous public uproar against involvement in any war at this time. This was predominantly because the youth that was protesting against the war were often, and in US also there was a polarization in this time. One was the section of the youth population which supported the involvement of US in the war, terming it to be an ideological struggle against the spread of communism. But there was another section of the youth population which opposed the involvement in the war. And the reason why was it that the section of the youth was opposing the involvement in the war? Why do you think? Why would students in universities oppose the involvement in war?
Huge loss of lives.
Huge loss of lives, so why not others, only the youth in universities?
Forced recruitment.
Forced recruitment. There's no forced recruitment in United States. But you're close.
Unemployment.
The reason for this comes from the fact that US higher education is privatized and extremely expensive. Okay? In US, higher education is privatized and is extremely expensive. And only two categories of people could afford higher education. Either the super rich or those who had access to some scholarships. Okay? And at this point of time, you see that access to scholarships and even this, ये मेरा आप लोगों को भी suggestion है, अगर आप में से किसी को भी US citizen बनना है, then one of the best and the easiest and the fastest ways to become a US citizen is get recruited in the US Army. The US Army allows recruitment even of non-citizens in the US Army if you are a student in United States. Okay? So आप जाइए US यूनिवर्सिटी में एडमिशन लीजिए और उसके बाद US सिटीजन बनने के लिए कोई ग्रीन कार्ड कुछ नहीं चाहिए. 5 साल के अंदर you will become a US citizen, not even a green card holder. If you serve in the US Army, and obviously you will be sent to combat missions in Afghanistan and other areas. So so I personally know people who have taken this route for US citizenship. So one of the things that was happening at this point of time was that higher education in the United States was extremely expensive and privatized. The only two ways were either you were too wealthy enough to afford or you had scholarship. And access to scholarship was conditioned on, access to a large number of scholarships was conditioned on having served a minimum of 2 years in the US Army. Okay, so the US lower socioeconomic groups who wanted higher education, for them entry into the army was important, and entry into the army at a time when US was unnecessarily involved in the war, which was turning out to be a graveyard for US soldiers, was not something that was a very popular decision with that section which was being forced into the army, not directly, but probably by some other constraints. So US never had military conscription. That is why I say in India we should have military conscription. All who want to fight against Pakistan or Siachen or China or God knows whoever must be given an offer and a chance. 2-year military conscription after 12th. Before you go to IIT, please go to the border. If you survive, you come back and you write IIT. Okay. So what is, in the sense that one of the things is, and this is an important ethical question also, that if in a state all are equal citizens and all have a equal responsibility to defend the sovereignty of the state, then why should military conscription be not a reality? And if you are arguing about equality, then probably military conscription is ethically, it's in terms of equality, that all citizens are equal. So everybody has to participate equally in terms of protection of the state. So in that context, that's a big ethical debate that has happened quite a number of times. Okay? There are countries like Israel, etc., where there is military conscription, right? So but that's not the case, and that is why a number of students who in the universities, who often came from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, opposed the involvement of US in a war which was not of any direct consequence to them. And that is also the public sentiment in United States was strongly opposed. Also, as I told you, that the Vietnam War was the first televised war. And this is the first time when US involvement in the war was also questioned on grounds of human rights violations. Where, for example, in Vietnam, you see one of the most popular pictures is of the My Lai massacre. Where basically a US army photographer photographed the US forces attacking the My Lai village in Vietnam, in which the US forces were indiscriminately firing upon the My Lai village, where a large number of women and children were killed. And this became a huge cause of public uproar in the United States against, and that the US troops were involved in serious human rights violations in the Vietnam War. Also, because the US was nowhere close to winning the war, so US adopted the strategy of carpet bombing. US said, let's bomb everything left, right, center. Then though we will win. So US started bombing not just Vietnam, even the adjacent areas of Vietnam. Because in Cambodia and Laos, because the Ho Chi Minh and others, they had built a secret underground tunnel over a long period, over a long duration from North Vietnam to South Vietnam, from Cambodia and Laos. So unnecessarily too much fighting going on at this point of time. Finally, in 1968, the next US President, Nixon, is finally saying that we will withdraw from Vietnam. And that is, but he says that we will Vietnamize the conflict, or in the sense that a gradual withdrawal of US troops will happen, and it will be the South Vietnamese forces who will lead the offensive. Okay, so it will be the South Vietnamese forces who will lead the offensives. From 1968 onwards, there's a gradual withdrawal of US troops, leaving the matter in the hands of the South Vietnamese forces. And by 1973, under Henry Kissinger, who finally negotiates the deal, in 1973, US troops are finally withdrawn from Vietnam. Okay, and from 1973 to 1975, you see, from 1973 to 1975, you see the North Vietnamese forces quickly defeating the South Vietnamese forces, reuniting North and South Vietnam under a communist government led by the Vietnamese Congress. And in this way, none of the stated objectives of the US foreign policy in Vietnam War actually succeeded. If the aim was to contain the spread of communism, that was not achieved. It also portrayed United States as an interventionist, big brotherly state in a poor light. Somebody who in its aim to quell the spread of communism was even willing to support the dictatorial and anti-people forces, as was visible in South Vietnam. And after this, the public sentiment in Vietnam, in the United States, was against any further troop involvement in any war, unless or until it directly served US interests. And that is why after 1973, you do not see a direct troop involvement of US again in any of the Cold War conflicts. Okay, any direct US troop involvement in any Cold War conflict does not happen after 1973, because war fighting somehow became extremely unpopular in United States at this point of time. So that's there. Now, so that is also something that you must know about the Vietnam War. Any doubts still here?
Communism was just an ideology of such a particular place. So why US was so offensive about different countries who were
So again, this is a question that somebody was asking the last class also, that if communism was merely a political and economic ideology, why US was so apprehensive about communism is predominantly, as I was saying, that if you have communism, say in Vietnam, then, and if you have communism, say in Vietnam or in Korea or in a number of other newly independent countries, then they would adopt a state-led model of economic planning. A state, and they would, what they would not adopt is a free market approach. And if they do not adopt a free market approach, it does hurt the economic interests of the Western Bloc. Why does it hurt the economic interests of the Western Bloc? That if they want a big market for their own goods, and for a big market for their own goods, they would require free trade at negligible or low interest rates or no tariff rates. Something that many of the communist government may not easily adopt. Primarily why? Because they may try to protect their own industries. So they may follow, and for example, you look at India, right? We did not all of a sudden adopt a free market approach. Rather, we kept our markets closed for a good period of time, right? And that was why. So, and that is why, again, because we were motivated by the idea of, import substitution, also a state-led economy. In a state-led economy, what happens also is that most of the big industries are owned by the state. If the big industries are owned by the state, the individual private players may not be able to compete against the state-owned industries. So in a way, a spread of communism would distort the access to market for a number of these Western-led blocks. And at the same point of time, if communism was to be established, communism was also going to be a one-party rule, not a multi-party democracy. And to that extent, they proclaimed their association more with the Soviet Union. And given that the Soviet Union also talked about the Communist International, that all the communist states would be united together and would follow similar ideas. So anyways, their proclamation of communism would not just hurt US economic interests, but also in the foreign policy arena, they were more likely to align with the Soviet Union than with the United States. So that's the reason. Okay. Anything else?
In case of the Vietnam,
Huh.
they are promoting to communism. Why not USSR has assisted to the Vietnam?
Why did not USSR, did the USSR assist Vietnam or not? So, for example, in this war, the Soviet Union's assistance to Vietnam is there again. And the Soviet Union's assistance to Vietnam, but is primarily in the form of assistance in the United Nations and building pressure on the United States to withdraw. Also, that presence of Soviet Union is there primarily because US is not resorting to any, so US, even while it is resorting to a military involvement in the war, it is not, again, planning to exterminate communism.
That time Cold War is going on. So, why not USSR involved in that?
See, what I'm saying is her involvement in a war does not always have to be a troop involvement in the war. Okay, involvement in the war can happen in many ways. For example, it does not mean that US intervention stopped after Vietnam. US interventions happened even after Vietnam. But for example, in Afghanistan, from 1979 to 1989, for 10 years, US was supporting the Taliban in Afghanistan to overthrow the communist government in Afghanistan. So US was intervening even in Afghanistan then, from 1979 to 89, but by providing economic assistance, but not by troop involvement. So involvement in a war does not have to be only troop involvement. It can be economic assistance, it can be partly military assistance, or putting pressure at the international level. So all these things were being done even by the Soviet Union to support and assist North Vietnam. That is there, but not a direct troop involvement. That is why we call this Cold War. That none of the wars see a direct military confrontation between the US and the Soviet Union troops. Okay, so that is there. So that is why that is what is happening here. Anything else?
So was it first war in which the chemical weapon used?
Pardon?
It is first war where the chemical weapon is used?
Yeah, this is not the first war where chemical weapon is used, but in the Cold War era, I mean, for example, in World War I itself, Agent Orange and other things were being used in World War I also. But yes, in the Cold War era, the Vietnam War was one of the wars where the US forces, were criticized of human rights violation because they were accused of using chemical weapons like napalm, Agent Orange, etc. in large numbers. The US involvement in this war, or the US way of fighting this war, was heavily criticized because it made no differentiation between civilians and those of the Vietnamese or those who were involved in the armed struggle. And that is why in the Vietnam War, a large number of civilians were killed. And this was happening because of the use of the chemical weapons also. So that is there because the US were not differentiating. The US argument was that it was not differentiating between civilians and the armed guerrillas, was predominantly because there is no way of differentiating at this point of time between the two. Anybody could be supportive of the Vietnamese Congress.
It was said the US used more bomb than World War II.
Yeah, that's true.
United Nations intervened in 1968.
So, see, both in the Korean War and the Vietnamese War, the US involved a carpet bombing approach, both in Korean War as well as, but more so in the Vietnamese War. And it is very commonly argued that both US troop involvement in Vietnam War and the number of, the amount of bombing that US did in Vietnam was more than it did in World War II. So that points to the whole bloody nature of US involvement. But why there is no UN intervention in the situation is again because the UN is paralyzed because of the Cold War differences, era differences between the Soviet Union and the US-led bloc. So if the Soviet Union was to pass any resolution condemning US intervention, that was definitely to be blocked by the US-led bloc in the Security Council. So you see that the Security Council was extremely paralyzed in the Vietnam War. And in contrast to the Korean War, there is no UN sanction for US involvement in the Vietnamese War. That is there. Okay. Anything else? So you can first write down about these two, then we'll talk about a couple of more. Now, so in terms, the Korean War also is also called by many as a lost war, primarily, or a forgotten war. Primarily because whenever we talk about the Cold War, the biggest, the Korean War is often not highlighted or is often not talked about very strongly. But it is called as a forgotten war because the extent of loss of lives that happened in Korea was also very significant. But though when you talk about Cold War, the other events such as the Cuban Missile Crisis or Vietnam War capture more attention than the Korean War. That is why sometimes it's also said that the Korean War was a forgotten war, as not many understand its significance today. So, because in the mains they can ask you a direct question: discuss the causes of the Korean War and its significance to the Cold War era. Okay, so that is something that we're going to talk about first. In terms of the Korean War, the causes of the Korean War. Now, as the Japanese withdrew from Korea after 1945 or after World War II, the communist led government by Kim Il-sung, communist-led government by Kim Il-sung. आज के न्यूज़पेपर में there is in today's newspaper there is a separate one by the New York Times, right? उसमें से कुछ आर्टिकल आपके काफी काम आ जाएंगे. So there are a few on the foreign policy. There's one on philanthropy. There is something on SARC. There are two on SARC. So you'll find some of those articles. उसको काट के जरूर रख लीजिएगा. Whatever you're finding good on SARC or foreign policy, or there is one on philanthropy also, or there is one on multiculturalism also, right? So there are a good number of articles. उसमें से whatever you find relevant, please cut it and keep it, as it can help you later. Okay. So as the Japanese withdrew from Korea after 1945, the communist-led government by Kim Il-sung came into power or control in North Korea, assisted by the Soviet Union, through economic, assisted by the Soviet Union through economic and military means. However, the US, apprehensive about a spread of communism in Korea, soon adopted a policy of supporting anti-communist regimes in the region. US troops were stationed at Busan and US supported the installation of Nego DM. See, that's the name, you can't help it. So, supported the installation of Nego DM, a military dictator who was strongly anti-communist. In Singmanri, sorry. Singmanri. DM is in Vietnam, I just confused while writing. So, a military dictator was strongly anti-communist in South Korea. Now, in 1950, an armistice was reached between North and South Korea. There was already in 1950 also a sort of armistice. Armistice is also a brief peace that was reached, in the beginning of 1950, also around the 38th parallel. In 1954, they returned to the similar armistice. So, an armistice was reached between North and South Korea along the 38th parallel in the Korean Peninsula. Now, as Kim Il-sung sought to establish communist control over a unified Korean peninsula, the North Korean forces attacked. Douglas MacArthur, actually, I did not tell you one interesting incident, but just for your knowledge, Douglas MacArthur actually suggested to Truman in this war that we should use the nuclear weapons against North Korea. But at this point of time, the US president, rather than listening to Douglas MacArthur, removed Douglas MacArthur from the position so that he does not entertain these wild ideas any further. And that is why he was the only ever 5-star military general in US Army to have been removed by the president on charges of indiscipline. So that is because he was of the opinion that we should not stop till we eliminate communism from the region, and if that requires the use of nuclear weapons, so be it. So, but again, the president was more wiser than his military commander. So you know, US, both Korean and Vietnam War, there are many lessons that governments lie to people, and governments lie to people, and governments, and for example, the Gulf of Tonkin incident, or what you see from that lying about their being on the upper side in the Vietnam War, or you see in the Korean War, a military commander and the senior military commander harboring different ideas about what should be done with Korea from the US president. So one of the things that the Cold War era and US foreign policy study tells you is that governments often lie to people, governments often proclaim something else and do something else, and that is why a blind allegiance to government in matters of foreign policy is something that you know, is not a very wise thing to do, and that is why questioning governments is what is relatively more important, and more so in the area of foreign policy. For example, US intervention in Iraq, where Saddam Hussein was said to have nuclear weapons. So many agencies, etc., said that we are very certain that they have nuclear weapons. But when asked, do you have proof? No, we don't have proof. And yes, and yet you see the US intervention in Iraq, Saddam Hussein is captured and killed, but no nuclear weapons were ever found. So you see that, and then later you see Tony Blair and others saying that we are sorry for the intervention in Iraq, but the damage had been done. So that is something which is also there. So you look at Libya, why to go any further? You look at Libya right now. Libya is in a state of mess after Gaddafi was overthrown and killed. There is no democracy, there is no stability. You see constant acts of terror and a general sense of political instability which is there in Libya. Hosni Mubarak was overthrown in Egypt, and Egypt is back under a military dictatorship. At least there is a military dictatorship which is providing some sense of stability to the region. Otherwise, Egypt is a very important nation, and Egypt falling into again political instability would have been more detrimental for the regional stability. So whether you see US intervention in Libya or again in Egypt, there is no direct US intervention in terms of troop involvement here, but yes, there is definitely US intervention. So you see that that's there. For example, you look in Syria, right? So the question is that it's perhaps the easy part is to overthrow. The more difficult part is to probably build after once you overthrow. So that is also something that's there. So, okay, let's write down. The North Koreans attacked South Korea. Now, we don't need to write the detail of what is happening in the war. Nobody is going to ask you. You just need to see what is there. So we say that in brief that from 1950 to 1953, following a series of attacks and counterattacks by North Korean forces and a UN-sanctioned, US-led armed intervention in Korean affairs armistice was restored. An armistice was restored in the region along the 38th parallel in 1954. Now, in terms of significance, we firstly say, that this was the first major test of United Nations in the Cold War era. This was the first major test of United Nations in the Cold War era, which was relatively successful in checking the territorial aggression by North Korea against South Korea. Secondly, it became, or the Korean intervention became a template for future US-led interventions to contain the spread of communism. It became a template for future US-led interventions to contain the spread of communism in the developing world. As US-led forces were able to prevent a communist takeover of South Korea, similar interventions were sought to be made in Vietnam, (1964) onwards, and Cuba, 1962-63. However, they turned out to be relatively unsuccessful. वैसे US interventions on similar lines in Latin America were more successful. They were, for example, in Colombia or in Nicaragua, you see that US interventions on similar lines were relatively more successful, where again, they were either supporting military dictatorships or supporting military coups against communist governments. Okay, so that's also there. But you see that this becomes a template for further US interventions. Now, and the last point that you can write about the Korean War was that the Korean War was the first of the many major conflicts in the Cold War era where first of the major conflicts in the Cold War era where the locus of conflict between USA and USSR had shifted from Europe towards Asia, Latin America, and Africa. That is the developing world. So most of the Cold War era conflicts are happening actually around the developing world, where the newly decolonizing countries can either move towards communism or capitalism, and that is where you see the whole conflict is actually happening. So that's there. The next thing that we're writing about is the Vietnam War, and then we'll talk about the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis, and a few other things as well. So quickly writing about the Vietnam War. In terms of the causes, as the Japanese forces withdrew after defeat in World War II, the French tried to reassert their control in the Indochina region, particularly in Vietnam. However, the Vietnamese Congress, led by, or it's also called in short as the Viet Cong, the Vietnamese Congress led by Ho Chi Minh an intensely nationalist individual were determined, and intensely nationalist individuals with communist links was determined to establish a national government without any foreign control in Vietnam. 1945 to 1954, the Viet Cong fought guerrilla wars against the French forces, finally resulting in a French withdrawal from the region. In a French withdrawal from the region. Then however, as the French withdrew, the spectre of a communist government led by Ho Chi Minh taking over Vietnam became a strong possibility. As the French withdrew, in South Vietnam, the US forces supported the installation of Ngo Diem, a strongly anti-communist dictatorial ruler. A strongly anti-communist dictatorial ruler. In 1954 to 1964, US troop involvement in Vietnam was indirect, as US military advisors were sent to aid and assist South Vietnamese forces. That is why, if you see the pattern the world over, okay, countries often, sensible countries often, refrain from a direct military intervention in another country's intervention. Okay, for example, you look at India's intervention in Sri Lanka, did not go down very well for at least for India. Obviously, did not go well for anybody, but definitely not for India. And that is also one of the reasons that why, for example, the US and Indian intervention in Afghanistan. India's intervention in Afghanistan have predominantly been in the reconstruction sphere or in the civilian aid sphere or in some military aid in terms of weaponry, but not in terms of troop involvement. Because it's, देखिए, अफगानिस्तान में तो आज तक कोई नहीं जीत पाया, ठीक है? So that's not a war which is worth being fought by troop involvement for India, because A, what are Indian objectives? How are they to be achieved? That has to be clearly defined. And that is why India has wisely stayed away from any troop involvement in the war, putting the boots on ground. That is why putting boots on ground has not been a very preferred strategy in Indian foreign policy, except obviously you see in the Bangladesh conflict or in Sri Lanka. So that's there. So you see that the US troop involvement in Vietnam was indirect, and US military advisors were sent to aid and assist South Vietnamese forces. 1964, there is the Gulf of Tonkin incident. The Gulf of Tonkin incident, where apparently North Vietnamese patrol boats So who won the 1965 war? No, I'm saying India-Pakistan 1965 war, who won? India did not win the war. Okay, 1965 war we did not win. Pakistan also did not win. But in the collective memory of both the countries won. Okay, many amongst the masses feel that we won the 1965 war, which is not the case. Nor did the Pakistani side win the war. It is true that we had the opportunity of, Shastri taking up Lahore, but that's wisely something that was not done later. And nonetheless, so we were relatively having an upper hand in some areas in the war during the 1965 war, but collectively, if you look in terms of loss of troops, in terms of loss of weapons, in terms of loss of tanks, in terms of loss of aircrafts, the damage is almost equal on both the sides. So, wahi hai ki whenever you're writing history, some 100 years later, you can always say in Indian history that we won the 65 war as well as the 71 war. It's true that we won the 71 war. So that's enough to generalize and say that we won the 65 one also, right? And so anybody does not want to record in their history that that we did not win or lose a war anyways. So that is there. Now, the Gulf of Tonkin incident, where apparently North Vietnamese patrol boats attacked South Vietnam, the US naval ship in the Gulf of Tonkin region. Became the officially cited reason for direct involvement of US troops in the war. In 1968 is the Tet Offensive. Despite official claims of a US impending victory in Vietnam, the Tet Offensive, led by North Vietnamese forces, the Tet Offensive led by North Vietnamese forces against US forces in South Vietnam proved that that the US forces were on the back foot. (1968 to 1973), a gradual withdrawal of US troops was put in place, and the South Vietnamese forces were to be provided assistance in the conflict. (1973), US forces withdrew finally, and by 75, North Vietnamese or the North Vietnamese forces defeated the southern forces to unify Vietnam under the Vietnamese Congress. So that's by 1975. In terms of significance, we say, in terms of significance, we say that the war proved to be a great setback. The war proved to be a great setback for US interventions declared objectives, that is, to prevent or contain the spread of communism. It was the first televised war. It was the first televised war. Barkha Dutt made her fortune out of the Kargil war, right? You've seen those videos, and for once, I just saw, I cannot do this. That was something that was unparalleled in Indian media's coverage ever before that in terms of televised wars. For us, perhaps the first major thoroughly televised war was the Kargil war. And so that is there. And more so for a woman journalist at that point of time, it was completely, unheard of. So, at least whatever Barkha Dutt's idiosyncrasies maybe today, but she made a career out of her own ambit. Okay, and that is there. In fact, many within NDTV started actually making their own career out of their own initiatives. Whether it's Ravish Kumar or Barkha Dutt. But obviously, with time things change. So, and nonetheless, it was the first televised war in which human rights violations by US Army were by US Army in Vietnam were widely reported, including the My Lai massacre of 1968. Thirdly, the Vietnam War provoked a strong anti-war sentiment in across US universities. I seriously want government should introduce this policy. वैसे भी we have very patriotic government. We should introduce this policy. Every higher education institution, you go to IIT, IIM, and NIT and medical colleges. 2 years military service is compulsory, no exemption. So Facebook will become the arena for peace mongering, not war mongering, right? So that is 101, one single shot. This is the solution. Okay, and this will address, people will understand that there is no glory in war. Now, so it provoked a strong anti-war sentiment across US universities. And the last point is the war provoked a major reconsideration of US foreign policy, where any further troop involvement the war provoked a major reconsideration of US foreign policy, where any further troop involvement in a war not of direct consequence to United States was strongly opposed. So that's also there. Now the next thing that we're talking about is the communist revolution in China. देखिए. So the next thing that we're talking about is the communist revolution in China. And okay, let's talk about communist revolution in China, and then we'll talk about the Bay of Pigs and other things also. That when you talk about the communist revolution in China, it is considered an important one, primarily because obviously you see China as one of the major communist, was one of the major communist states during the Cold War era. After Soviet Union, if there was any other state which was a powerful communist state, it was China. And also, I mean, we keep reading about China a lot because India and China both attained independence almost at the same time. Also, both were relatively poor Asian countries at similar levels of development currently in 1949-50. And both were erstwhile, before 1700s, were powerful economies of the world. So there were strong number of parallels between China and India. And you see, at beginning of independence also, both were similar. But today there is a widespread difference in terms of military capabilities, economic capabilities, etc. between India and China. And so that also has significance. Now, when you talk about the Chinese Communist Revolution, we say, जो हमारे mains के लिए important question है, if the question has to come, again, if the question has to come on Communist Revolution in China, there are, देखिए, in China से दो तीन चीजें और हैं जो आ सकती हैं, okay? One is the Boxer rebellion in China, and the other is the Opium Wars. Okay. Now I'm not discussing Opium Wars and Boxer rebellion right now. If we get the time, we will discuss it later. If we do not, it is given there in your, the handouts that you have, the vision printout material. Please read the Boxer rebellion and the Opium Wars also. They're just these two. Okay, Boxer rebellion and Opium Wars. Do read them, because I somehow have a hunch that you must know at least that basic also, because these are major attempts. One is an attempt led by the Western Bloc, which is the Opium Wars. During the 1800s, everybody wanted trade relationship with China, and everybody wanted trade relationship with China, which actually resulted in the Opium Wars. Okay, and during 1904, there was an attempt to overthrow, the Western players from China, and that resulted in the Boxer rebellion. So in दोनों चीजों के बारे में आपको थोड़ा सा पता होना चाहिए. So because they can give you a question, a 5 marker also on Boxer rebellion or something. Now, what we are substantively going to discuss is the formation of communist government in China, and the whole process through which it happened, and also what is the role of Mao in it. Also, what you see after this is what is the role played by Mao once the communist government established in China in the first 2 5-year plans and in the cultural revolution in China. Okay. Now, so when you talk about China, what is to be understood is that China was never anybody's colony, right? China was never a colony of any country. It was never a colony of any country, and China in 1910 to begin with, actually, China was a vast region where there at the center was the Qing dynasty. The Qing dynasty was in control in China, but the dynasty's control in China was never very strong or centralized. Just like in 1750s onwards, the Mughal control in India was there, but was not very strong, centralized. In a similar manner, China's Qing dynasty was in power in 1910, but it did not have a strong control over the rural countryside, where there were a number of warlords. Whose influence actually extended to the areas around them. These warlords were more or less the autonomous rulers, but they maintained a symbolic link with the Qing dynasty. So you see that a strong centralized government was not in place, but the government in place in center had links with the warlords in the rural countryside, and that was the Qing dynasty. However, 1910-11, there was an attempt to overthrow the Qing dynasty in China by a military coup that was led by Yuan Shikai. Yuan Shikai was a military general, and he, along with Sun Yat-sen, Yuan Shikai, along with Sun Yat-sen, actually planned the overthrow of the Qing dynasty. Now, Yuan Shikai was a military general, but Sun Yat-sen was a medical doctor, and he had done his higher education in the United States. He was in favor of replacing monarchy in China, and with the establishment of a nationalist multi-party government, a nationalist multi-party democracy with the freedom of speech, liberty, etc. Or a more multi-party democratic kind of structure to be established in China. And again, the Qing dynasty at center was not a very strong centralized government. There was no strong movement towards modernization. Agricultural productivity was less, and China had clearly lagged behind. And China of 1910 was not like the China of 1700. And it had lagged behind in industrial production, in agricultural productivity, unemployment, etc. All these discontent was there with the monarchy already. And Yuan Shikai was the military general who manages to bring in this coup. And Sun Yat-sen supported the coup. But the hope was that Sun Yat-sen hoped that a democratic structure would be established. But that does not happen. And instead, Yuan Shikai imposes a military dictatorship as soon as he overthrows the Qing dynasty. And from 1910 to 1916, till Yuan Shikai is alive, there is a military dictatorship in China. After Yuan Shikai's death in 1916, you see the beginning of 1916 to 1926, a decade that once Yuan Shikai died, the attempt of Sun Yat-sen was to establish now a democratic structure in China. But this was easier said than done, because the Qing dynasty had ceremonial links with the warlords and maintained friendly links with the warlords. However, Sun Yat-sen's coming to power would not lead to maintenance of these friendly links, because if a multi-party democratic structure is going to be established with elections and all that, then what is going to happen to the warlords? The warlords had continued their control and privileges in the areas for a long period of time. So the warlords were not at all in favor of establishing a democratic form of government. And so began from 1916 to 1926 the period of civil war in China. And this civil war in China had three players. One were these warlords. And 1916 to 1926 is also called the warlord era, because the warlords refused to submit to the central government led by Sun Yat-sen. And the warlords were on the one side, and on the other side, you see, this was Sun Yat-sen's party. That was the KMT, or the Kuomintang. So, the Kuomintang was the party led by Sun Yat-sen. And the Sun Yat-sen's party had also joined with another another group which was opposed to the warlord. And this was that of the communists. 1918 is the Russian Revolution. After 1920, the communist government was set up in, a communist party was set up in China also. And the Communist Party in China also was in favor of overthrowing the warlords. But the difference between the Kuomintang and the Communist Party was that the Kuomintang wanted a multi-party democracy, whereas the Communist Party that had come up in China wanted the establishment of a communist state in China. But both had a common objective of subduing the warlords. And so both of them joined hands after 1920 onwards. Now, till 90, and this coming together of the communists and Kuomintang was made possible by Sun Yat-sen. And Sun Yat-sen was a respected leader, respected both by the communists as well as by the Kuomintang. He was able to keep both of them together till 1925, till he was alive. And till he was alive in 1925, he was able to keep both of them together. And by 1926, the warlords were finally subdued by the Kuomintang and the communists. Now, once the warlord threat was taken care of, the next question began. The question was, who was going to rule? Now, China. Now, I mean, just to give you a context again, if you look at Afghanistan, a similar problem is there. Right? You have warlords, Pashtun warlords, these warlords, that warlords in the rural area, in the rural countryside. Whereas in Kabul, there's been always the debate of firstly, the first challenge is to subdue the warlords. And also, apart from warlords, there's another player, and that is the Taliban. So you see, there is the Taliban also, there are the warlords also, and there is the national government in Kabul also, in Kandahar also. So you see that all of this makes the situation so complex that on the one side you have to subdue the local players and allow them and make them accept the national authority. But on the other side, you also have to decide whether it is going to be the national government, whether it is going to be the national government led by, whether it is going to be, the national government led from Kandahar, or whether Taliban will also be given a share of the power at the center. Because, see, that's the whole trilateral conflict in Afghanistan. तीन महान लोग हैं, एक तालिबान, एक national government, एक है the warlords. Unless the problem is not, if the problem would have been much easier to tackle if there would not have been either the Taliban or the warlords. Okay, and the presence of these three always make the situation more messy. In a similar manner here, the problem was warlords, Kuomintang and the communists all. So in that context, as the warlords were taken care of, the next question that was left to be decided was whether the Kuomintang or the communists would actually, who would come to power or would they come to a consensus. And that is why you see that after 1926, there is the beginning of another phase, and this is the civil war phase. Again, there is the resumption of the conflict where the communists are, after 1926 onwards, the communists are actually led by Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong is the one who's coming to play an important role in the communists after 1926. And after Sun Yat-sen, it is Chiang Kai-shek, right? So Chiang Kai-shek actually comes to power after Sun Yat-sen's death in the Kuomintang, and that is where you see that the war is, again the civil war is beginning. But just to give you a context, Kuomintang's party was way more popular than the Communist Party. Why? Because Sun Yat-sen's relationship was primarily with the Kuomintang. The Kuomintang had played an important role in overthrowing the Qing dynasty, and so you see that the Kuomintang was relatively more popular to begin with in 1926. And once the warlords were overthrown, the Kuomintang came to power. Okay, the Kuomintang took up the power in China, and soon it started attacking. And soon, you see the conflict broke out between the Kuomintang and the Chinese Communist Party. Why? Because Chinese Communist Party now said, we want radical land reforms. We want redistribution of land in rural areas, etc. And they started fomenting trouble, bringing up around peasants in support for these demands. Kuomintang cracked down on the Communist Party, and you see the situation starts to again worsen between the two after 1926. And clearly you see that in China, you clearly see that at this point of time, in the north, the communists were already being defeated. In the North China, the communists were already being defeated, and they were restricted primarily to some of the areas in the southeast portion of China. The result was that you see that the communists were on a back foot. And from here, that is why Mao is so important. That from relatively a back foot position, Mao was able to bring about a turnaround in the Communist Party's fortunes to taking over a complete control, decisively routing the Kuomintang by 1949. But this happened in the context that the civil war began in 1926. But in 1931, who invades China? Japan. Japan invades China. And Japan invades China. And Japan takes over what is Manchuria. Japan takes over this Manchurian region in 1931, and in North Korea already the Kuomintang was in power. So Kuomintang was unable to defeat the Japanese and prevent the Japanese takeover of Manchuria. In fact, this was a major criticism that the Kuomintang had to suffer, that its primary motive was actually to defeat the communists, and that is why they were so over-involved in trying to subdue the communists that they failed to defend China against the Japanese invasion in 1931, in spite of being clearly in control. Similarly, so at this point of time, as the war broke out with Japan over Manchuria in China, the Kuomintang stopped its hostilities towards the Communist Party, and the Communist Party got a brief relaxation. However, by 1933, as the Japanese had taken over Manchuria, again 1933 onwards, there is a resumption of hostilities, and again the Kuomintang is cracking down on the Communist Party. By 1935, the Communist Party is reduced only to a small area in the south. It's reduced only to a small area in south, and now you see that a major heroic turnaround is attempted by Mao, who plans an escape, or what is called as the Great Escape, for these communists from South China all the way to north. So to escape from the North Vietnamese forces, which were to escape from the Kuomintang's forces, which were attacking the communists, and the communists were relatively on the back foot. He planned an escape where secretly they started moving from South China all the way to the northernmost part of China. And this was a 8,000 mile long march, which is known as the Long March. This was a long march in which 1 lakh Chinese communists began the march, or 8,000 mile long march. But they had to suffer huge setbacks, and by the time they reached north, only 8,000 communists remained, and the rest were killed by the Kuomintang. So this was already, they were on the setback, and they somehow managed to reach North China, and there they established their autonomous control. And this is something that they started in 1935. By 1937, China is again being attacked by whom? Japan. China is now again being attacked by Japan, where Japan tries to take control of Nanjing. Right? So now Japan is taking control of Nanjing region, which is again this eastern. Nanjing is again in this eastern region. Nanjing is again in this eastern region of China, and the whole of the Chinese cities, major, whether it's Shanghai, Beijing, all of them are predominantly on the eastern coast. So you see that all these major areas were under the Japanese threat in 1937, and the Kuomintang was clearly in power, and again it was unable to defend China against the Japanese attack. Both 1937 and 1931 invasions by Japan proved the incompetence of the Kuomintang, or their inability in defending China against the Japanese invasions, and which made them hugely unpopular in China at this point of time. On the other hand, you see Mao's forces had managed to reach northern China, and there they established their own autonomous government in the region, and they brought about radical land reforms, redistribution of land amongst peasants in the rural areas in North China, which made the Communist Party in northern China now more popular. And that is why from 1937 to 1945, there is no major hostility between the communists and the Kuomintang. Why? Because World War II is ongoing, and the major aim is to keep the Japanese out. The Kuomintang tried to focus on the Japanese rather than the communists, which gave the communists a breathing space. And 1945, once the war ends, you see again the resumption of the civil war. And now the communists are the one which are forcing the Kuomintang on the back foot. 1945 to 49, the communist forces in North adopted the guerrilla warfare strategy and were able to thoroughly rout the Kuomintang, forcing them to withdraw from mainland China in 1949 to Formosa or Taiwan. And 1949, the Kuomintang was forced to withdraw from the Chinese mainland and take over and establish their control in predominantly in Taiwan. And you see, that is why in 1949, Mao, again, in this 1945 to 49 period, played a very important role in this overthrow of the Kuomintang. And as the People's Republic of China was established in 1949, Mao became its eventual leader up till his death later. And so once he came to power in China, now the question was to consolidate the hold over China, and more importantly, to bring about the political and economic reforms. If you wanted to bring in industrialization, if you wanted to increase agricultural production, that is something that had to be done quickly. Otherwise, the communist government would also turn out to be unpopular. So increase industrial production to increase agricultural production. The Chinese government now quickly looked upon at the Soviet Union's model. And that was the model of state-led model of economic planning, 5-year plans. 1953 onward, the first 5-year plan is adopted. 1952 onwards, हमने कर लिया, उन्होंने भी तभी करा, right? So they adopted the first 5-year plan. Again, the aim was to increase agricultural and industrial production, and they managed to achieve their first target till 1957. By 57, the first 5-year plan achieved their agricultural and industrial production targets, but these targets were themselves not very high. They did not set up very high targets or ambitious targets. Only modest targets were set up, which were achieved. But in 1957 came the question that if China was to rapidly modernize, it had to rapidly increase its pace of industrial production. And so Mao came up with what was called as the Great Leap Forwards. And the Great Leap Forward, what was the Great Leap Forward? This is important to know, because this was the major economic policy of Mao. Mao said that we will lead a state-led model of industrialization, but this state-led model of industrialization would have community at its center. Meaning, for example, for increasing industrial production, what you need? Iron and steel, right? So he said that we will set up iron and steel industries, but by setting them up in rural areas, in communes. So he basically said that in rural areas there is a surplus labor, and there is already surplus labor in the rural areas and the wages are low. So we will set up iron and steel industries in rural areas in China. And small iron and steel industries will set up. For every 5,000 workers in rural areas, we will set up a commune. These workers will engage in agricultural production also. They will also engage in industrial production, where they will set up iron and steel industries in rural areas. However, the problem with this was that iron and steel industries set up in rural areas in 1957 onwards never increased the production substantially. Why? Because firstly they had no prior experience in these fields. The workers had no prior experience in these fields, nor there was already availability of good quality technical assistance for setting up these industries. The result was that the steel being produced by these communes was of a poor quality. Also, their aim was to increase production, but production did not increase very significantly because the communes did not have the technical know-how or the assistance required for increasing the production. On top of that, the agrarian labor was being diverted away from agriculture towards meeting these industrial labor needs, because of which even the agricultural production did not increase substantially. On top of that, once the industrial production was not increasing substantially, now China resorted to importing machines. And for importing these machines, who could they import it from was the Soviet Union. So they imported these machines from the Soviet Union, but how were they to pay the Soviet Union? The Soviet Union had a shortage again of food commodities. So the Soviet Union imported food grains from China. And China, in a barter system, kind of a system, Soviet Union was importing food grains and China was importing machinery from the Soviet Union. But China's agricultural production had not increased. On the other side, industrial production had not also increased significantly in the second five-year plan. And China, in spite of having a huge population, was diverting food grains to import these machineries, which led to famines in China itself, in which more than 1.5 to 2 million people suffered from 1957 to 1961. So the great leap forwards, rather than being a leap forward, actually turned out to be a great leap backwards, in the sense that it did not increase industrial production, it did not increase agricultural production, it precipitated famines in China. And that is why many questioned the wisdom of Mao's leadership at this point of time, terming it to be a huge setback. And who was criticizing Mao's policy at this point of time? The Mao's policy were predominantly being criticized at this point of time by the professors in the universities. So many questioned the rationale of Mao's economic policies across Chinese universities and in urban areas in China, which were dealing also with food shortages. And Mao now said that those who are opposing my policies are the ones who are anti-communists. They are the ones who are anti-communist. They are the ones who are being supported by the United States. They are the ones who are trying to overthrow the communist rule in China. They are the ones who are the enemies of the Chinese Communist Revolution. And so he started what was the Cultural Revolution in China. He said that we should clamp down on anybody who opposes the Communist Party or the Communist Party's rule in China, because they are the enemies of the Chinese Communist Revolution. And most of these people were predominantly the ones in the urban areas who were professors in universities or involved in some other governmental positions. And so the government launched a crackdown upon these individuals. And Mao had a strong appeal amongst the youth. Mao had a strong appeal amongst the youth, and he called upon the youth to defend the communist revolution in China. How? By criticizing the four olds: old culture, old tradition, old people, and old thoughts. And anybody who opposed this set of communist ideas were seen as a traitor. and as a anti-communist individuals. And so Mao brought in this policy that whoever was opposing the Chinese Communist Party's policies was to be sent to the rural areas. And this is ingenious of Mao. Mao said, what do these professors think of themselves? Do they know that do they know the hardships faced by the rural people and how they are supporting the communist revolution in China? They should be given a first-hand taste. And so he said that all these professors in universities must be compulsorily sent to work in the rural areas, in the rural fields, to increase agricultural production. So either labor camps or anybody who opposed the communist rule was to be either sent to labor camps or was to be sent to the rural areas to compulsorily serve in rural areas for 2 years. ये भी कर सकते हैं हम. So that is also something that we can also do. So in that sense, that the cultural revolution in China thus was a strong backlash that was led by Mao against anybody who criticized Mao's policies. And he was largely and strongly supported by the youth. The youth in universities strongly came out in Mao's support, and they proclaimed their allegiance to the Red Book to the Mao's Red Book that he proclaimed, talked about the principles of the communists. And often the student in universities also strongly criticized their professors, arguing that they must be sent to the rural areas. Right? So you see that the communist backlash happened with the Cultural Revolution, and Mao tried to stop the criticism against his rule in China with the Cultural Revolution. So in conclusion, we say that Mao's contribution in the Communist Revolution in China was definitely in consolidating the Communist Party's hold over China against the Kuomintang from 1935 to 1949, and thus establishing and consolidating the Communist Party's rule over China. However, once the Communist Party's rule was consolidated, a series of failures in the implementation of the 5-year plans and their conception, including the Great Leap Forward, led to Mao resorting to the Cultural Revolution to clamp down on any anti-communist criticism in China. So how does China find itself lifting out of the mess that it had found itself by 1969? Is when finally, after Mao's death, you see that Deng Xiaoping comes to power from 1979 onwards, and he decides to open up the economy. And that's also something which is happening. But nonetheless, one thing also about the Chinese Communist Party's foreign policy that we've not talked about here is that 1951 onwards, 52 onwards, as Nikita Khrushchev, 1952 onwards, after the death of Lenin, after the death of Stalin, once Nikita Khrushchev came to power, he at least talked about peaceful coexistence. He said that communism and the capitalist world order can coexist peacefully together without trying to eliminate each other. But Mao said that this is betraying the principles of the communist revolution, that you're talking peace with the traitor. So 1953 onwards, Mao said that not Russia, but China is the true leader of the communist revolution. Okay, so that is also something which is there. Now, he also supports the Korean Revolution. He's also supportive of the Vietnamese conflict of North Vietnam in the Vietnamese conflict also. And you see that he tried to take up the leadership of the Communist Revolution even in the 1960s, actually. So that's also part of their foreign policy. That under Mao's rule, actually, the differences between the Soviet Union and Soviet Union and China became wider over who was the true leader of the communist revolution, okay, at the global level. So that's also something which is broadly there. Now, आपके मेंस में जो आपसे क्वेश्चन पूछा जाएगा वो यही पूछा जाएगा that discuss the evolution of the communist revolution in China, or especially with respect to Mao's role in it, or discuss the role of Mao in the communist revolution in China and in the period thereafter. Okay, so Mao पे या तो direct question आएगा या about the communist revolution in China. So these are the two things that you must know about. Any doubts still here?
If Mao was having a greater appeal among the
Youth.
why the Tiananmen Square massacre was there?
So okay, so why is Tiananmen massacre happening? That's something that we'll talk about later. But you've asked, so I'll tell it to you here itself. That the Tiananmen massacre is happening in a different context. Mao was popular amongst the youth when in the 1960s. But the Tiananmen massacre happening in 1989 is happening in the context at communism was collapsing throughout the world. And Mikhail Gorbachev had adopted the policy of relaxing the controls or relaxing the controls over the media, over public participation through his policies of glasnost and perestroika. So Mikhail Gorbachev in Soviet Union had moved towards the relaxation of the communist control and allowing a greater freedom of speech and expression. So many within China, especially the youth in 1980s, demanded a similar relaxation even in China, and that is what led to the Tiananmen Square protests. But the way Soviet Union and China responded to them was very differently. While Gorbachev himself adopted these policies, but in China, you see the communist government clamped down upon any anti-communist government protests there. Though China had also moved towards opening up its economy much earlier with Mao Zedong, with Deng Xiaoping. He had from 1979, China had moved towards opening its economy. But in terms of opening its economy was one thing, but allowing anti-government protests was another thing. So it did go for economic reforms, but it did not go for political liberalization. And Tiananmen Square, the way they handled the Tiananmen Square was reflective of the fact that China was still not in favor of relaxing the political restrictions or moving towards away from the one-party rule of the Communist Party in China. Okay. So that is there. Anything else which you want to ask? So you can quickly, we are only in short writing about this. I've also given this in the PowerPoint presentation that you can look at later. So let's quickly write down about this and then we'll look at something else. This is our 10th class, right? Yes, sir. So we have enough time. So now the communist revolution in China. See, in these things you don't need to read more than this. Okay, the topics that I'm, for example, अब आप communist revolution in China को आप घर जाके आप पढ़ेंगे भी, if you read it from a book also, you're not going to find something more than this. Okay, and even if you will find, there will be more peppy details, or more interesting details which you may not, which may sound very interesting, and you will find also them to be very interesting, but you can't write them anywhere in the answer. So इतना ही है लिखने में, इतना भी आप लिख लें बहुत है. Okay, so. In terms of the communist revolution in China, you see, and actually just one more thing. So what happens after this is that in 1949, in the beginning, as the Communist Party comes to power in China, the Western blocs did not recognize the Communist Party in China. Rather, they recognized the Kuomintang-led government in Taiwan as the government in exile of China. And for a long period of time, the Chinese Communist Party-led People's Republic of China was not granted international recognition by the Western-led bloc. And it's only much later that they're granted this, okay, from 1960s onwards. Okay, so 1949 to 60, that was not the case. And that is why you see the deep divisions between Taiwan and, in the mainland China. Is that China talks about a one China policy and considers, Taiwan as also its part, whereas Taiwan considers that, it is independent, and that and in Taiwan you have a multi-party democratic structure, but in China you have a one-party communist state. Okay, so that's there, and China does not like and does not view it with a soft approach if somebody tries to establish direct diplomatic relations with Taiwan. So that's predominantly because of their sensitivities around the whole issue. So in terms of the communist revolution in China, what you see is that from 1910, the Qing dynasty was overthrown in a military coup led by Yuan Shikai and supported by Sun Yat-sen, supported by Sun Yat-sen. One more interesting thing: both PRC, both China and today the Communist Party in China and the parties in Taiwan claim that they are the true, inheritors of the legacy of Sun Yat-sen, and both, alongside the portraits of Mao and other leaders in China, even Sun Yat-sen's portrait finds a central place, but so also in Taiwan. So both claim the legacy of being the true inheritors of the legacy of Sun Yat-sen, and Sun Yat-sen is considered as the father of Chinese nationalism by both the groups. Okay, so the Qing dynasty was overthrown in a military coup led by Yuan Shikai and supported by Sun Yat-sen. In 1910 to 1916, Yuan Shikai, 1910 to 1916, Yuan Shikai led military dictatorship was in place even when Sun Yat-sen and his Kuomintang, Sun Yat-sen and his Kuomintang party, Sun Yat-sen and his Kuomintang party, which is also called the KMT, supported the establishment of a nationalist multi-party, a nationalist multi-party, or you can even write a nationalist democratic government with political liberties, with political and civil liberties. In 1916 to 1926, following the death of Yuan Shikai, as the KMT aimed to take over control of China, this was bitterly opposed by the Chinese warlords. That is why this is also called as the warlord era, who insisted on maintaining their autonomy, in the rural countryside. In 1920-21, the Communist Party also emerged and joined hands with the Communist Party also emerged and joined hands with KMT to subdue the warlords. Sun Yat-sen was able to keep the communists who wanted the establishment of communist regime in China and the Kuomintang who supported a more democratic structure. Together, he was able to keep the communists and the Kuomintang together despite their differences. In 1925, Sun Yat-sen's death was followed by a breakout of bitter rivalry between the KMT and communists. Once the local warlords were subdued. 1925 to 1930, the civil war broke out and the Kuomintang was clearly in charge while the Kuomintang were clearly in charge while the communists were on a retreat. In 1931, hostilities ceased between the two groups. As the Japanese invaded Manchuria and the KMT was unable to resist the Japanese attack. In 1933 to 1937, as the hostilities resumed, between the two factions, Mao leading the communist bloc, leading the communists resorted to a long march to rescue the communists from south and marching to the northern countryside an 8,000-mile long journey, an 8,000-mile long journey to escape KMT's aggression. In 1937, Japanese attack on Nanjing was the Japanese attack on Nanjing was not the Japanese attack on Nanjing was a major setback to China and the Kuomintang party, which was in control. The popular sentiment swayed away from KMT as it was unable to defend against successive Japanese attacks. In 1945, the hostilities between KMT and communists resumed after the Japanese surrender. However, the communists had already established a mass base. The communists had already established a mass base in northern regions by virtue of land reforms and some increase in agricultural productivity. While the KMT had failed to defend against Japanese invasions in World War II. So you see that from 1945 to 49, The Chinese communist guerrillas successfully defeated the Kuomintang, which was forced to abandon mainland China and was settled on Formosa, or which is later being called as Taiwan. So that is there. Now, in terms of Mao's policies, I'm only writing in short. In terms of political and economic policies, Mao embarked upon two 5-year plans. (1953 to 1957), where the set targets, though modest, were achieved to increase agricultural and industrial production. However, 1957 to 1962, the Great Leap Forward, to rapidly increase agricultural production increase agricultural and industrial production was sought to be implemented through establishing communes of workers in rural countryside. However, iron and steel production did not significantly pick up. Moreover, the steel was of a poor quality, as the communes often lacked technical know-how. attempt to import machinery, attempts to import machinery from USSR led to food grain exports to Soviet Union for payment for machine imports, eventually precipitating a food shortage and famine affecting 1.5 to 2 million people in China from 1957 to 62. So now if you see, Nehru was relatively doing a good job. After independence, we also had similar problems that China had to deal with, but Nehru was relatively doing a good job in that context, that if you compare it with what Mao was doing in China. So now, so that is why you see that the Great Leap Forward was also called as the Great Leap Backwards, because it did not either increase agricultural production or industrial production, rather it led to famines and more increase in hardship for the people. So that's there. It's a political and in terms of political and economic policies, that is what we write. Written this much? So now in terms of the social policies, you say we'll stop after this. आपके सब्र की परीक्षा हो गई है. So see, my only suggestion is please read this now and keep it. अभी पढ़ के you keep it for now. Don't need to read after this. Once, please keep reading with what we are doing in the class, so that once you read now, उसके बाद February onwards, you anyways will be looking only at prelims or more so at prelims, right? So you'll not get time to read after that. So you read it now, put it freshly in your memory now, so that later when you read after prelims, तब ये ना लगे कि ये क्या हो गया. Okay? So that is why after prelims, the first thing that you must do is, देखिए ये तो नहीं बदलेगा, right? So after prelims, the first thing that you must do is you should revise paper 1. Before your result comes, you should revise paper 1 and paper 4, क्योंकि ये नहीं बदलेगा, right? Neither paper 1 nor paper 4 is going to change. So revise paper 1 and paper 4, and once you have revised, then you start writing your obviously test series and all of that. एक बार प्री के immediately बाद पढ़ लीजिएगा इसको, world history को, and then once in the last month of your preparation. 3 readings are enough. इसमें से आना होगा, so you will be able to do it, and you space yourself in a manner that you can do it. 3 or 4 readings are enough. आप जो test series में questions करेंगे, that would also be a kind of a revision only. So that is more than enough. Distributed, but you read once now, only after the prelims, so that you don't find it completely unrelatable immediately after that. So in terms of social reforms, in terms of social policies, sorry, you see that Mao introduced the Cultural Revolution. देखिए तभी ये कहा जाता है कि if the economy fails, what you can resort to is cultural nationalism, right? If you're not doing very good on the economic front, you can always resort to criticizing anybody who is criticizing you, right? So rather than allowing your critics to say something, you criticize your critics. Okay, so that's a better strategy. So Mao did that. So cultural revolution in China was introduced from 1965 onwards as Mao tried to clamp down on any dissent against Mao decided to clamp down on any dissent against the Communist Party or Mao's rule. Professors in universities and those in civic or political life who opposed Mao's policies. See, one of the good things, also one of the funny things also, is in the, this is also one of the jokes doing the round. That right, that you have the current the triple talaq bill to criminalize. So one of the jokes doing around is that if you give triple talaq, that would be null and void. There is no talaq like triple talaq. What happens after that is that if you say triple talaq, 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 you get 3 saal of jail, right? But your marriage is not void. You still are married, right? So which is the so if this bill is going to prevent or strike fear in the minds of those who may resort to using it even after it being declared as illegal, primarily or because it has some social sanction, you will put the individual who's giving talaq in jail to save a marriage, right? The husband is in jail for 3 years. So, I mean, that's probably not a very wise way to save a marriage either, right? So, in that context, you see that, when you are drafting laws, you need wisdom. And wisdom is something which does not come if you have so many amazing people, right? So it's not that the leader is supposed to be very educated. That I personally do not believe that a so-called literacy level of a leader defines anything. But what does define is those who he is surrounding himself with. Because your advisors have to be right. If your advisors are not right, then you will do amazing things like this. So in that context, anyways, so any people also question what is the intent of the bill, but nonetheless. So professors in universities and those in civic or political life who oppose Mao's policies were forced into labor camps and forcibly made to take up manual labor in rural countryside. So, the cultural revolution, so that is also something that was there. Now, lastly, in terms of foreign policy, we say that Mao refuted Nikita Khrushchev, who came in power after Stalin's death in Soviet Union, refuted Khrushchev's idea of Khrushchev is USSR's leader, right? Idea of Nikita Khrushchev. Khrushchev's idea of peaceful coexistence of Soviet-led communist bloc and the Western capitalist bloc. Rather, he argued that Communist China was the true leader of the Communist China was the true leader of the revolution. He strongly supported the North Korean and Vietnamese Congress in the respective conflicts. So we say as a conclusion that while Mao played an important role in bringing the Communist Party to power. So in conclusion, we say that while Mao played an important role in bringing the Communist Party to power in China in 1949, his policies thereafter failed to increase economic productivity and the backlash against his policies resorted to the cultural revolution of 1960s. A significant turnaround in China's fortunes happened after the death of Mao, when Deng Xiaoping opened up the Chinese economy from 1979 onwards. So that's there. One more interesting thing to know is actually that as China was moving towards opening its economy in 1979 onwards, it was also a bit before that, even partly from Mao's time itself, and more so even after that, had started moving towards universalization of primary education and healthcare. There was also an article in the Hindu, I think, 2-3 days ago, right? That you look at China and India and you look at healthcare and education, you see that China had moved towards universalization of education, etc., much before we even thought about it. And that also partly explains the differences between the two. And what is important to know is that China moved towards universalization of primary education and universalization of healthcare, even in the face of limited budget. Even when China was not economically very prosperous, it moved towards these two things despite budget shortages. And we keep saying that we don't have budget for education and healthcare. Okay? So actually, for example, just to give you some perspective, if you go to a, if actually that much it does cost tertiary healthcare in case of a serious problem, can cost you for a 15-day hospital stay something like 7 lakhs, 6, 8 lakhs, 8 lakhs, etc. It's another matter. It's another matter that we do not have the capacity to pay this unless and until the state actively intervenes in terms of universalizing healthcare. The cost of healthcare will not come down, and people will not have the ability to pay that. So you know, the fact is that corporate healthcare has found such a big market in India because the state has not taken up the responsibility. If you have a functioning public healthcare system in the state, the corporate healthcare sector itself will found its role to be very less. But that is not there. So blaming the corporate for the ills of the state is perhaps, again, you know, pinning the blame, while the systemic flaw is underspending on healthcare and education. So any doubts still here? Okay, we'll stop here. In the next class, we have to talk about European Union, United Nations, also about Israel-Palestine formation historically, and also partly European Union, United Nations, Bay of Pigs, Cuban Missile Crisis. So these are some of the other 4 or 5 main Cold War era topics that is there. We'll have 1 or 2 classes more after that also. 1, I think, more. 12 at least we'll have. So that because we have some Latin American business, Asian, African decolonization also to talk about. So we'll do that. We'll stop here. Thank you. Meiji restoration and everything I'll cover. Japan we'll talk about briefly, so we'll talk. So partly European Union, United Nations, Bay of Pigs, Cuban Missile Crisis. So these are some of the other 4 or 5 main Cold War era topics that is there. We'll have 1 or 2 classes more after that also. 1, I think, more. 12 at least we'll have. So that because we have some Latin American business, Asian, African decolonization also to talk about. So we'll do that. We'll stop here. Thank you. Meiji restoration and everything I'll cover. Japan we'll talk about briefly, so we'll talk. बताएं